Welcome to our CWS webinar. My name is Susanne Gilmore and I will be your presenter today. Our webinar will be approximately 1 hour long and we will hopefully answer many questions for you. What is a COAD and why does your community need one? Also present today is the rest of our team. Barry Shade, Associate Director of Domestic Emergency Response, and Sandra Kennedy-O's Emergency Response Specialist. They will be here to help me answer many of your questions. Our webinar will be recorded. The webinar will be available for you to share with other members of your organization in approximately 48 hours by visiting the web link listed here, www.cwsglobal.org/LTR webinars. And I will also put up this link at the end of the presentation again for you to copy. Some housekeeping items. You are muted, but you can ask questions by typing them into the question box to your right of the screen. As our webinar is relatively short, scheduled for just a little over an hour, I believe it best to answer all of your questions at the end of this presentation. I will also provide contact information for additional training and resources for your group to include CWS and my contact info again towards the end. Let me introduce CWS before we get started. Founded in 1946, the Church World Service mission is to end hunger and poverty and to promote peace and justice. Supported by 37 U.S.-based member communions, CWS provides programs that feed the hungry, provide clean water, reduce vulnerability, and help those forced from their homes. With more than 1,000 employees in across 5 global regions, CWS operates programs in more than 30 countries. This map outlines the regions of our domestic response. My colleague Sandra Kennedy-O's covers all states marked in red, and Barry Shade, our Associate Director for Domestic Response, covers Hawaii and the Pacific Territories. My region is shaded in blue. All the states in green were Joanne Hale's region, our dear colleague who unexpectedly passed away this last August. CWS hopes to have the position filled in early January. So, our domestic response program provides CWS material resources. They may be emergency cleanup kits, blankets, hygiene kits, baby care kits, and school kits. We have 2 warehouses where we store these supplies, and anyone, may that be a VOAD member, a state VOAD member, a congregation, maybe an emergency manager, can request these to support disaster survivors after an incident. Following a disaster, after the initial stages of rescue and relief efforts, many communities find there is still a long way to go to find a new normal in their communities. We offer training. Recovery Tools and Training is a one-day workshop led by CWS disaster specialists and leaders from denominations and other groups with information to assist long-term recovery organizations understand the efforts necessary to lead a community in coming to a new normal. Consultations or community-specific training can be designed by community leaders and CWS disaster specialists. CWS does not have a cookie-cutter approach to training and education, but will design educational and training opportunities to meet the unique needs and desires of a particular community. Follow-up mentoring and continuing education, recognizing that no one workshop or curriculum can cover all aspects of long-term recovery or address every issue. The CWS disaster specialists are available to communities by phone, email, and return visits to answer questions, provide guidance, and assist with other unanticipated needs. As our more than 6 decades of experience proves that those with the least means have the hardest time recovering following a disaster, CWS disaster response activities in the U.S. focus on the most vulnerable individuals and families. Early response and sustainable grants are available to local long-term recovery groups to assist with the initial tasks of organizing and staffing or to sustain the effort over the long term. While many organizations are willing to finance direct aid to people affected by disaster, CWS is unique in targeting its grant to organizational needs. These grants range usually from $3,000 to $5,000. So, our webinar is intended to help all community organizations and individuals understand how collaborative efforts can prepare communities for disaster. The main goal of our training today is to show how collaboration can help communities avoid some disasters and recover from disasters faster, more efficiently, with a pre-existing structure in place. Communities and citizens are unquestionably better served if a COAD is in place for planning and education long before a disaster strikes. Many COADs are developed in the midst of a disaster. The reality, however, is that COADs should be formed well before a disaster ever strikes your community. Developing a COAD provides opportunities for people to participate in a range of measures to make their families, their homes, and their communities safer from the threats of crime, terrorism, and disasters of all kinds. The COAD concept is based on successful programs utilized by many communities around the country. Examples of other programs that may be part of a COAD include Community Emergency Response Teams, CERTs, the Neighborhood Watch Program, the Medical Reserve Corps, MRC, and Volunteers in Police Service, VIPS. Communities are encouraged to establish a COAD while keeping a holistic approach to community response in mind by using the FEMA whole community concept. This model engages emergency management practitioners, organizational and community leaders, and government officials by promoting the collective understanding and assessment of the community needs. Based on this information, the partnering organizations may determine the best way to efficiently and effectively organize and strengthen their assets, capacity, and interests. By doing so, a more effective path to societal security and resilience is built. So what are the benefits? No two disasters are alike. The impact on each victim is very different. The needs of each are unique and often unmet. However, a community that brings all of its resources together in a COAD can effectively respond to the needs of disaster victims in a timely way, thereby reducing the social and economic impact of the disaster. The COAD will be able, once well trained, to assist with the initial response as well as the long-term recovery efforts. A community can simply not effectively recover from a disaster without the help of many like-minded organizations picking up the pieces. The definition of a COAD, community organizations active in disaster, is that it is really an umbrella organization, which is composed of representatives from public, private, and not-for-profit agencies, convened to build better prepared communities. The faith communities play a vital role in the COAD. Faith organizations can provide the muscle in volunteers, money, and material for the disaster survivors. Given the range of functions, organizing and coordinating emergency human services is no small task at any level. Nationwide, the National Voluntary Organizations Active in Disaster, or National VOAD, serves as the coordinating body. At the state level, such as for example in Missouri, associations like the Missouri Governor's Faith-Based and Community Service Partnership for Disaster Recovery and the Missouri Voluntary Organizations Active in Disaster support an integrated system of coordination. Promoted at the local community level, which may be city, county, or regional, community organizations active in disaster, and I refer to them here as COADs, played a crucial role of coordinating emergency human services at the very basic level. Sometimes, instead of a local group called a COAD, the role of community coordination is undertaken by similar organizations, such as a local citizen core council, caring community association, local/sub-state voluntary organizations active in disaster, or some other local community collaborative association. Any of these groups, regardless of title or name, can take on the role of coordinating emergency human services, as long as they work in concert with key partner agencies, including but not limited to local emergency management agencies, community organizations, faith-based organizations, and social service agencies. The organization and collaborative work of organizations intending to form a local COAD is to establish a nonpartisan membership-based organization that serves as the forum where organizations share knowledge and resources throughout the disaster cycle, which includes preparation, response, recovery, and mitigation. The first step of anyone thinking about forming a COAD in their community should be to talk to your local emergency manager. The COAD's long-term survival and successes are dependent on cooperation with emergency management. Emergency managers all across the nation, on the other hand, will be thrilled to have a COAD in their community to take on many of the functions and tasks in this emergency cycle. Your state VOAD will also be a good source for training opportunities, participation in member calls, and monitoring of newly forming groups. Call on all organizations that have an interest or are already involved in possible rescue, response, and recovery work after a disaster. Some of these may be quite obvious. Others will join as you establish your organization and visibility in the community. Your initial meeting should be open to anyone from the community. Out of the initial meeting, try to form a working group to adopt the name. Excuse me. Name officers and set up bylaws or operating guidelines. As you hopefully establish your COAD before your community will suffer through a disaster, you should at least meet quarterly to make sure contact information is still correct, share possible training opportunities, organizational updates, and changes, and of course valuable face time with all member organizations and individuals. COADs will include any agency, individual, or organization with a role to play in any phase of the emergency management. This should include disaster services agencies, emergency management agencies, and public, private, or not-for-profit organizations with an interest in addressing a community's emergency management needs. Your first meeting, if you follow these suggested items, is really just intended to get to know each other discuss on how to move forward, and to really steer the interest amongst attendees to move forward. On this slide, I have just outlined a few things to think about when you have your very first meeting. And here are some more detailed examples of organizations you may want to invite to your initial meetings. Usually, the Chamber of Commerce. Your business community has an interest in recovery and response to a disaster. Citizen core councils, ethnic cultural organizations. If you have any culturally diverse or minority population in your community, please make sure you have representatives at your table. Faith-based disaster response organizations, fire and police, food banks, health departments, homeless coalitions, private businesses, schools and higher educational institutions, and many more, as they may be able to provide volunteers, the workforce you need in the recovery and, of course, in the response. Look at your specific community and its makeup to find who may be still missing and needs to be part of your COAD. Now it's time to establish an executive committee. Executive committee members are important as they help perform the functions of a local COAD. Since you will be all volunteers in this process, the executive committee needs to support the chair in order for the COAD to be effective. You will need to decide what responsibilities and tasks the executive committee will perform. These may be planning for presentations at meetings, member recruitment and retention, publishing agendas and meeting minutes, treasurer responsibilities, developing disaster protocols. Again, many of the documents needed initially to stand up a COAD have already been developed and can be found on the National VOAD site. I will provide this link at the end of the presentation. I need to introduce and explain the different phases of the emergency management to you. The COAD can play an important role in all of these phases. It usually starts with mitigation. Mitigation means any activity taken to eliminate or reduce the long-term risk to human life, property, and the environment from the effects of natural and technological hazards. Prevention. Prevention is any activity taken to avoid hazards and minimize the negative effects of a disaster. Preparedness, any activity taken in advance of an emergency that will improve emergency readiness and develops or expands operational capacity. Response. Actions taken immediately before, during, or directly after an emergency occurs to save lives, minimize injuries, lessen property and environmental damage, and enhance the effective recovery. And finally, recovery. A short-term activity to return vital life support systems to minimum operating standards and/or a long-term recovery to help people affected in the area to get them to their pre-disaster conditions. You need to know the risks in your community. What is the likelihood of a hurricane approaching your area? Will it rather be a tornado threat or maybe a blizzard? Your emergency manager will be able to answer these questions for you and how he or she prepares for a natural or man-made disaster. Also have your Red Cross representative give a presentation on how they prepare for impending disasters, what their response entails, and what the COAD can do to assist. Get as much knowledge as you can. As you learn about disasters, it will also be important to understand how responses differ for different disasters. An airplane accident may require a different response to, let's say, a school shooting. We will now take a look at the guiding principles of your work. A COAD should provide a forum for information sharing, communication, cooperation, and collaboration between agencies involved in disaster relief work. The COAD should also be a resource to citizens of your community during all phases of the disaster cycle. And of course, the COAD should support and be a resource to community emergency management. Emergency management will gladly make you a resource. I have worked with COADs, for example, where EMs, emergency managers, have been able to provide some financial assistance to the group, as well as providing much needed equipment, for instance radios. Once the COAD is functional, many worries of your EM will be eased. And in everything you do, don't forget the 4 C's. Cooperation, communication, coordination, and collaboration. And I certainly always like to talk about the 5th C in all the work we do in recovery, may that be rescue, response, relief. The 5th C is certainly compassion. You need to have compassion in your work. I will introduce some goals or objectives that you may want to start with. The ideal characteristics of a COAD will certainly become its goals and its objectives. An existing group has assumed the responsibilities, or an independent interagency group has formed a COAD. All agencies are engaged in the process. The COAD or subgroups meet as often as necessary. The second goal could be as described above. Your community will greatly benefit if you form a COAD, which can, after a disaster strike, seamlessly move into a long-term recovery group. You have already established what each organization can provide. You've built a trust and understand to work collaboratively in the process. The time of a disaster, or shortly thereafter, is simply not the time to exchange business cards and get to know each other. In all our efforts to help your community to recover from a disaster, volunteers are absolutely essential. As we all have probably hired a contractor at one time or another, we know just how expensive this can be. Now just imagine how much further the money of your group can go if you have volunteer labor and can use the donated money for material and maybe other financial assistance to homeowners. In the aftermath of a disaster, it often seems that everyone cleans out their closets to help the people in need. A community can be overwhelmed within hours with all donated items dropped at their doorstep. Many donated items are unfortunately totally useless and do not benefit the needs of the affected disaster survivors. Winter coats for New Orleans and thousands of stuffed teddy bears in the aftermath of the Newtown school shooting. Of course, other donated items, especially solicited to help the community, will have to be stored and distributed. So you see that this is an important role that can be taken on by the COAD. Training, training, and more training. Take all possible opportunities to train your members. Training provided by organizations that work with all phases of the disaster on a daily basis, some webinars, other online training through FEMA, and of course organizations like Church World Service. As we already looked at the wheel of phases of the emergency management, I would like to show you some examples of direct involvement of the COAD in these areas. Have a representative attend a local LEPC meeting. Have the COAD be part of your community's special mitigation events. Examples are Severe Weather Awareness Week, Preparedness Month events, usually held in September or early spring, Storm Spotter training, just to name a few. Assist local organizations or your EM with specific events and of course an overall knowledge of all mitigation efforts being discussed in your community. Talk to groups that are already busy with prevention efforts. Help citizens understand terroristic threats. Or maybe now a hot topic is Ebola. Work as a voice for community disaster prevention by giving presentations on home fire safety, cybersecurity, and so on. Get informed. Become an entity for prevention in your community. Especially in smaller communities, the COAD can really take on a huge role in this area. Everyone in your group should have the same knowledge level regarding disaster work. Some organizations do great work every single day, but many may have initially no idea what the acronyms means and what the work may entail. Education, orientation, and training is really the key here. It can start off by learning a completely new language that FEMA speaks, that the Red Cross speaks, and many other response agencies. Get informed. Your EM will gladly test a group with donations and volunteer management. I have seen it happening many times. Make sure you're ready. If not, don't be afraid to say so. This is not an easy task. You need to work on developing trust within your member community, as well as with the community as a whole. You may also be able to assist other immediate response agencies, such as Red Cross, Salvation Army, Southern Baptist. This is your community, and no one knows it better than you. The long-term recovery of a community is so much easier with an existing COAD already in place. The short-term recovery involves providing the immediate assistance a disaster survivor may need: food, clothing, financial assistance, short-term planning. The work of the long-term recovery focuses on a holistic approach to ensure that even the most vulnerable in your community can recover. Get the training on all aspects of the long-term recovery. CWS offers at least 2 or 3 times a year webinars on how to successfully provide long-term recovery services to your community. We, and of course the National VOAD, has a broad library of documents you can use to support these efforts. You plan, train, and prepare now to be ready when the disaster strikes. Here on this slide, I want to give you some examples of where you may be able to assist. There may be single-family emergencies in your community, such as large housing fires, maybe a water main break with multiple families displaced. Community events such as power outages due to winter storms or severe storms during the summer months. We know, unfortunately, that flooding can often affect regions and sometimes an entire state. Declared and non-declared disasters can happen in your area. I live in the Midwest, and we often simply don't have the dollar amount attached to a disaster, often due to sparsely populated areas being affected. Without a COAD in the initial response, and of course then in the long-term recovery, to address still existing unmet needs, your communities could simply not recover fully from a disaster. I would like to illustrate with this slide on how long the different phases of the disaster wheel can take, Recovery, especially long-term recovery, is the longest and in many ways the hardest and most emotionally trying of these phases. It starts with the warning of an impending disaster. In yellow is the time shown when the disaster has stricken your community and the search and rescue phase is happening. In green, we have the initial damage assessment to homes and the overall infrastructure of your community, followed by relief and the response phase. This is the phase when the disaster survivors are being sheltered and fed by multiple organizations. In red is the outline of the short-term recovery. People may receive assistance with more permanent housing. Client casework is being conducted to provide the initial help, again with clothing, food, maybe funeral or healthcare expenses. And now just look at the huge blue areas in this pie chart, which is the long-term recovery period. Often forgotten, but one of the most time-consuming and most important phases to bring a holistic approach to make your whole community whole again and bring this new normal to the disaster survivors. Things will never be exactly as they were before. This is why we refer to a new normal. It is also important for the COAD to understand the letter of assistance that may be utilized by disaster survivors. If you have a federally declared disaster, federal help will come to those impacted by the disaster in the following order shown here. This is a very concise version of the process, but one of the first things you will want to do is to begin to understand this process. Talk to a FEMA VAL, Voluntary Agency Liaison. For your region, for the full version and the explanation of the many ways that FEMA can assist the community in recovery. FEMA operates regional offices, and each region has a FEMA Voluntary Agency Liaison to assist voluntary organizations. Your state office may have a state VAL to assist with your questions or any presentations. The FEMA VAL or the state VAL can certainly help your community to get started in preparing for the recovery. They can help identify those resources and partners and in many instances help you to make the necessary connections. They can also assist the community in ensuring that they maximize the use of federal resources first. And of course you can visit FEMA's website, and I will have the link at the end, with many training opportunities and documents that are valuable to your local COAD. This slide is intended to show you the different components that may need to be in place for a successful COAD as well as for a long-term recovery group. These are subcommittees that can be explored and trained for COADs. All of these are great topics to explore before the disaster in your community strikes. Know who is in charge of these components. Select chairs. It also gives you an idea of what groups or individuals you may need to be still need to be part of your COAD. Who has an understanding of construction management? Is there a retired contractor, for example, that would be willing to take this on? What agency is good at communication for your group? It's good to look at this wheel and explore the needed agencies or individuals you will need to invite to be part of your group and can be called upon if needed in the future. Keys to successful COAD operations. Again, as outlined, early and ongoing communication. Stay in touch after a disaster strikes, communication within 24 hours of the event. Community involvement, effective public communication. Let your community know you're there and be visible. Let them know what you're doing. Let them know what help you may need. Of course, think about many creative initiatives you can be part of, you can utilize for preparedness training. inclusive and in partnership. You need agencies to support you. The more, the better. Everybody brings a certain unique skill to the table. And don't quit. I have found again and again that it can be a challenge for COADs to sustain the initial momentum, especially if your community had no disaster in quite a while and the interest may quickly fade. Keep it interesting. Try to provide as many training opportunities as possible. FEMA offers a wide range of free webinars. Look often at the National VOAD site for new documents or resources you can provide and review and discuss with the group. Engage in training locally through your Red Cross, Salvation Army, emergency management. And definitely be part of the LEPC to see what your local community is doing and what is planned for the future. So this slide is just a quick look at what different components and what different interest areas you should explore. Disaster case management versus disaster casework. Very, very important to understand. Of course, volunteer management. You will be tasked often to have a volunteer reception center for unaffiliated, spontaneous volunteers immediately after a disaster, but also maybe for skilled work groups to come in. Donations management, as I mentioned before, there will be an abundance usually of donations. Which can be used? Where will you warehouse it? How will it be distributed? Long-term recovery organization and the process can be very difficult to understand initially. We know emotional and spiritual care is an important part in our disaster work. People have needs. They experienced a tremendous trauma. They may have had a death and injury in their family. They lost their home. Mass care. It takes a lot of people to provide feeding and sheltering to people affected after a disaster, and much, much more. Here's contact information for our partners. Go on their website, see what training can be provided. AMCOR, Lutheran Disaster Response, Presbyterian Disaster Assistance, Brethren Disaster Ministries, United Church of Christ, just to name a few. And as promised, here is the web link to the National Voluntary Organizations Active in Disaster. Great resource for you. Please, please look at the templates. You don't have to reinvent many things, especially for your guiding documents. And then additional resources, and I especially want to point to the ADA National Network. Look what your community is made up. If you have an area, maybe you have housing for some people with disabilities, have a representative at the table to really provide the help needed and to provide the correct help needed for people with disabilities. Don't assume you know what their needs may be. It's also good to have an animal-assisted crisis response member or somebody from the Humane Society as part of your COAD. And here's our website. Please visit us often. We post our recorded webinars here. You find our contact information and much, much more. We have, I would like to introduce a newly published booklet for you. It's called Help and Hope. It focuses on disaster preparedness and response tools for congregations. So if we have pastors here at the webinar or people who would like to share this with their congregation, it's a great, great book to show congregations how they can get involved in the so important disaster work. And then as promised, here's our contact slide again at the bottom where this you can pull the webinar to share with other members of your agencies. www.cwsglobal.org/LTR webinars. And then, of course, we have to give credit to the Indiana COAD Guidance Manual, National VOAD Manual, Missouri VOAD Manual, and Google Images. I would like to thank you for your participation today. The work we do for people affected by disaster can actually not put into words. Especially when we look at the most vulnerable in our community. If you have a COAD in place, if you build a COAD prior to the disaster, you as a group will benefit and your community will benefit. And please join us again for future webinars. I hope you enjoyed our teaching tool today, and we hope to see you in the future. Thank you so very much.